for one reason or another, people are curious about what happens with American women. And as an American woman, I want to speak to that, but the story is not monolithic. It is pretty complex, messy, and layered, in large part because of the history of the United States. Women in this country, as they were in many other cultures, were property for a very long time, couldn't vote. We are celebrating the centennial of women being given the right to vote in the US in 21, but that right, for example, did not include Black women. It didn't include other women. We've had different acts like the Chinese Exclusion Act for immigration that would have impacted Asian women. We had the interning of Japanese persons during World War II here in the US, another threat to Asian people, Asian women. So I don't think you can really understand the role and the history of women and perhaps their capabilities and capacities unless you understand the history of racism in the US, which is tied to the history of slavery. In my field, I'm a minister, a theologian. There's something called feminist theology, and then there's something called womanist theology. Black women, for example, would feel that the feminist movement had left them behind. They weren't really included as either voices or leaders. So the notion of womanist thinking emerged out of the academy in religious studies, really as a way to affirm Black women, and for Black women to say, as we approach our own freedom, we're not going to, not only are we not going to exclude other women, we're not going to bash the men, so to speak, on the way to our own freedom, because the freedom and the validity and the humanity of men of color is just as important as our freedom. That Black women see feminism in the US as really a function of white women's understanding of feminism. Black women in the early days of the move to get women's votes were involved, but they weren't allowed to lead or have voices. Feminism in the 60s, 70s, in the 80s was largely led by white women. Women of color, I think, are also affected by various class structures, depending upon what the class intersections are. And of course, there's this term intersectionality, right? Our gender identity, our class identity, our racial identity. All of these things get very complex in the United States because of the histories of these things. When we look at whether people are left or right in terms of their politics, it's often not that simple. And it's more issue driven than it is identity driven. And yet there are people for whom their identity, we talk about identity politics in the US all the time, and some people poo-poo that, wanting to simply assign progressive ideas to people of color. So once again, you have this whole layering in of racism and dehumanizing and making difference deficient. I think that is perhaps one of the hallmarks and one of the foundational narratives that come along in the US with discrimination against women, against people of color, against immigrants. The United States is a nation of immigrants. Black folks were brought here as slaves. Indigenous people were already here. Everybody else came over on a ship, escaping something else and coming to build something else. So we don't necessarily have this notion of what's purely American, and to the idea that we could discount immigration and those differences of language and culture. We all have them. And there's this myth of, the quote unquote melting pot that supposedly distills away all that is uniquely you in order to become this American thing. And women are caught up in that whole myth. When I think of the relationships that I have with women in the United States, white, Hispanic, Asian, and African-American, we each from our own places in American society are trying to carve out not only our identities, but how we're moving through time and space and how we even connect with one another. We don't want to play games as to whose oppression is the worst or whose oppression has been most restrictive. But I do think one thing we have in common is this understanding that to the extent that our society has made us feel deficient or has devalued who we are because we aren't white women born in America. And that applies to every woman of color in the United States, depending upon your skin color, your hair texture, whether you have an accent of some kind, what kind of dress you choose to wear, because race and class intersect in the US. And a lot of those are working women who aren't making a living wage and maybe have to work 2 and 3 and 4 jobs. So this idea that one, as an American woman, has the luxury just to think about these highfalutin ideals is just false. And there is as much tension across the United States between classes of women, and sadly, even between racial and ethnic groups. I think as we begin to think about what really matters in terms of how you value humanity, even how you value differences of opinion, this notion that difference simply can't be made deficient. That's at the heart of racism. And that's a stain that the United States still needs to name and own and understand that it has work to do to repair it. I was almost 40 years old before I reported to a person of color. And so that distinction of how you move, how I even move through the world in the US as a Black woman is very different than many of my college colleagues. And even now in ministry, even some of my white female colleagues still have an advantage in terms of how they move through the world simply because of the American construct. Racism allows white women to assume a place of supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I don't mean the Ku Klux Klan, although that's a particular manifestation of it. But as long as you're been told that you are of this upper class and that the other people are threats to your own success and survival, you will naturally associate yourself, because you've bought into this whole myth that one race is superior. That's I'm white, I shouldn't have to fight for these things. And so they are coming, right? The statistics say that white people will no longer be the majority in the US in another 20 or 30 years. So this was true after emancipation. It gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan, that somehow those people were going to take our jobs and threaten our own survival, as opposed to us all uniting at that level of class in society and work for the betterment of everyone. Race is still this very ugly specter. It's part of the narrative of the United States, and until it's acknowledged as the narrative, it's not just the legal separations. There's still a narrative that white is better, and we live into it almost blindly. So the us and the them, the us is white, the they is everyone else. That's the harsh reality of American socio-political context, and why we struggle, because nobody wants to name that. Or the people who do name it, you're accused of being divisive if you name it. When I think about this understanding of bridging differences and how we manage that, in my work, I've always worked with very diverse kinds of teams, both in the corporate world and now in the ministry world. And we have this ideal of, even on the Statue of Liberty is engraved the Latin phrase, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And we tend to think that we can only be identified, particularly in America, as one kind of thing. It used to be the immigrant said, I have to assimilate. I have to give up everything that makes me who I am in order to be accepted as American. And that's, for people of color, there's a certain form of almost whiteness that one must clothe oneself with. The vernacular, the way you dress, the kinds of music that you're perceived as listening to. You're cultured if you like opera, but maybe not so cultured if you just like hip hop or Motown, right? although there are a lot of people like Motown. But now there are certain kinds of music that's considered to be cultured, or certain kinds of theater, certain kinds of art that's considered to be more cultured. People sometimes raise an eyebrow. I have a group of white friends, 2 white women in Chicago with whom I go to the opera regularly. We were educated at the same institution. We do similar kinds of things. We happen to love opera, and people find it strange that I, a Black woman, had opera series tickets with my 2 white female friends. So I hope as we emerge as women, that complexity that is the American woman will not be lost. America, in a lot of cases, quite honestly, doesn't have all the answers. We got a lot of things we got to work through ourselves. And while I'm grateful to be an American, I can't imagine myself. I was born, raised here, but I live in this complexity of America that's still 2 nations, where women, in some cases, have certain privileges, and in a lot of cases, they don't. And so the things that women of color are concerned about may not be maybe some of the same things that women of a certain class, poor, lower income, low wage women, if we could get beyond this notion that somehow the women of color are not your sisters, we could unite and advocate for a healthier society for us all. But that specter, that stain of racism still plagues us, even to the point where it divides people who should be natural allies for justice and for well-being.